anytime, you can walk away, with your health and your safety, I view it as a success. Are there things to learn from it? I'm sure the investigation will yield that out, but, absolutely. As President Joe Biden mentioned, resources, and this is something that I've harped on in previous interviews as well. The Secret Service is a relatively small agency in terms of agents. I believe maybe 3,000 or so worldwide. And so when you think of the mission that you have and you think of protecting sites like the first assassination attempt or sites like the golf course, these types of sites have a lot of different areas where you can have a shooter's nest, as you saw in this particular case, areas of ingress. And so you have to make sure that, you have the appropriate resources to provide that 360 coverage, around sites that you saw yesterday.
But what scaling up of resources would actually provide coverage for, say, an 18-hole open-air golf course, realistically? I just wonder if there's enough staff and personnel in the world to make this a completely foolproof scenario for the former president, who, of course, golfs a lot.
Right. Yeah, nothing is foolproof. But I think the sheriff mentioned this before in his press conference. He talked about how he felt as though, or he knows that the former president Trump doesn't have, or he's not a sitting president, right? And so he doesn't have the cadre of resources that you might see Joe Biden have. And even with his threat level being high, he still doesn't. Everyone knows when the president is in town. You see the big motorcade. You see the number of local resources, state and federal police. I'm not saying that it has to be to that degree, right? But there has to be some middle ground. And with that middle ground, there's a lot of resources from the local and state level that are involved with that 360 coverage. You're tapping into the county departments, the sheriff's departments, the local PDs. You're asking for marked units to be at different areas so you can kind of deter someone who could possibly hide in the bushes. But that takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of financial responsibility, and it takes a lot of planning logistically. And I think that's kind of where we are in terms of copycat artists and things of that nature that we see kind of coming out the woodworks.
Donald Trump today is blaming rhetoric from Democrats for what happened here. Brian, that's, I realize, something that you can't comment on because it's pretty difficult to connect the dots directly to an attack like this. But he's also suggested, since the attack in Butler, that President Biden has essentially slow-walked this issue, that he hasn't been given the resources that he needs despite requests. Can you just speak to the way the service works, how a request would be honored like that, and following what we saw in Butler, why he didn't have additional security?
There are a lot of layers that go into getting different resources. And a lot of those layers, ironically, fall on some of White House staff as well. At the end of the day, former President Trump is conducting a campaign, and there's often a kind of a tug of war, if you will, between staff and security. If the Secret Service had their way, President Trump wouldn't go into any open air areas. He would always be in hard areas. He wouldn't do any rope lines. He wouldn't do the things that, as a security professional, put him at danger. But staff, and understandably so, they want him to be seen. They want him to be a man of the people. They want him to reach out and shake hands. And so, that tug of war is a real thing. And so there may have to be a little bit more on the security side in terms of those negotiations as you go from site to site and stop to stop during the rest of this campaign.
Well, Brian, it's not just the slow walking allegations that Donald Trump is making about President Biden, but also rhetoric that he says both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have been using, that he said this particular would-be shooter believed, and that this is the reason for the attempts on his life, especially given your focus now on cybersecurity. To what extent should we be factoring rhetoric into this and the kind of theories that can be propagated online through social media, and how hard that could be if you're the Secret Service or another charged with protecting a candidate or former president to filter through when there's so much of it out there?
This is where I think interagency plays a critical role. I spent 5 of my federal government years with the FBI as an intel analyst before I became a Secret Service agent, and combing, those sites, looking for the rhetoric, whether it be homegrown militias or international aspects, that interagency communication, and that communication filtering to agents on the ground, agents on the shift, professional staff within the organization, providing threat intelligence, real-time threat intelligence, I think will be very, very important moving forward. In terms of, conjecture or the walking the back of whether or not, President Biden is offering those resources, I think the service is focused, and rightly so, on the facts at hand, and hopefully the different layers of government, hopefully they can get through some of this red tape and provide those agents on the ground with what they need.